In terms of your research of the school experiences of Puerto Rican students, your older sister, Lydia Cortez, shares stories about growing up with you in Brooklyn. She explains that your parents came to New York City from Puerto Rico and notes that although you liked school, it was difficult to start school speaking Spanish alone and having to learn English without ESL or bilingual classes, as you noted. Your longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Luis Moll, notes that he speaks with you primarily in Spanish, as he is also from Puerto Rico, San Juan. He recalls once asking you in Spanish where you are from in Puerto Rico, and that you answered laughing, "De Brooklyn." His response, "That will do." He adds that you always laugh when he greets you at a conference with "Cómo estás, mama?" or "How are you doing, mama?" Describe your work in this area also as the editor of the book Puerto Rican Students in U.S. Schools.
You know, when I met Jim Banks at another time, at another ERA, when we sat down for coffee, he asked me to write a book for his series. So this is after Affirming Diversity. You know, I had written Affirming Diversity. And I said, well, you know, I have two books in mind. One is a book on Puerto Ricans, and another one is something about learning communities and, you know, multicultural learning communities. And he said, do that one. I said, yes, but the one on Puerto Rican students is, you know, my heart. And he said, okay, do mine first and then do the other one. And so, of course, I paid attention to him, and I did his in 1999, and I did the Puerto Rican Students in U.S. Schools book in 2000. And as I said, I knew that this would not be a bestseller, but for me it was really important to do this because I, as a teacher, I did not have these kinds of resources available.
Sure.
And you know, a former student of mine reminded me the other day, she's now a faculty member in her own right at another university, and she said, you know, I tell the story to my classes a lot about how you had a student at Brooklyn College who said that he didn't know that Puerto Ricans could write books. I said, yes, that's true. And so that was another reason that I wanted to get this out there, because I had read books, and there had been books published on Puerto Rican students in U.S. schools since the 1970s, and many articles and so on, a lot of them with a very, you know, sort of negative perception of Puerto Ricans, or deficit kinds of attitudes. Although some of them were quite good. Francesco Cordasco was an Italian-American who wrote a lot about Puerto Rican students. He was very dedicated to the topic, and I really appreciated his work. I never met him in person, but he did send me a review that he wrote of one of my books, and I think he died a year later. He was in his 80s, so I never got to meet him, but I really respected his work. But in all the books that had been written or edited, like he edited a book that was about Puerto Rican students in U.S. schools, the Puerto Rican community and children on the mainland, I think it was called. And there was one chapter by a Puerto Rican. Now that wasn't his fault. He was looking for the people who were doing the work, you know, the scholarly work, and there weren't that many.
Sure.
So by the time I went to write and edit Affirming the Puerto Rican students in U.S. schools, there were a good number of Puerto Rican scholars around. And I determined that most of the articles, most of the chapters would be written by Puerto Ricans. Not because we're the only ones who can write these chapters and who could do this research, but because it is important for people to know that, yes, Puerto Ricans do write books and they do write chapters, and they are involved in these issues. So, so that's why I wrote that book. And, you know, it did fill my heart because I felt that there was a need for it for teachers, as well as for young people. I mean, I'll give you another example. When years ago, I got I don't know, I think it was a letter. It was way before the internet, from a young woman who was a student at an elite private school here in Massachusetts. She was from the Bronx, and she was on scholarship. And she wrote to tell me that she wanted to invite me to her school. So I went, and I spoke to the students, and then she said to me, I think I have every book that's ever been written by a Puerto Rican woman.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I said, really? She must have been 15 years old. So I went to her room, and she had this stack of books, mostly by novelists.
Okay.
And there was Affirming Diversity.
Oh.
And I thought, what is this 15-year-old girl doing with Affirming Diversity? This is not, a fun book for her to be reading. It's for teachers. But it just shows the hunger that people have, because they don't see themselves in books. They don't see themselves in research. They don't see themselves being respected in the research that is done about them. They don't see themselves, respected and affirmed in the academy, in the research that's done, in the people who are, working on these issues, some of whom do wonderful work. But we also, as a community, have to be represented there.
Wonderful. In terms of your work in teacher persistence, Dr. Patty Bodie cites your fierce hopefulness that you infuse into the lives of teachers as one of your most significant accomplishments. She defines this in the scene that throughout your writing, you lead teachers to maintain hope against a backdrop of political struggle and social strife in public schools, by urging teachers to preserve the ideals of public schools as a site for full participation in a democratic society, while transforming teaching to meet the needs of some of our most vulnerable children. You sustain teaching as a political and optimistic endeavor. Have you wavered in your optimism? And if so, why?
I am, I guess, a joyful person. My husband tells me that I have the happy gene. We were just talking about this yesterday because, I'm a half glass full person always. And he's my, he's the other half of that. So he's the glass half empty. And so we sort of balance one another out. But yeah, I think that it's important for teachers to be hopeful, because if we're not, why are we there? What are we doing? And I say the same thing about people in the academy and, researchers. If we don't believe that what we do can make a difference, then we shouldn't be doing it. And so that has guided me, I guess, throughout my life. Part of it is just my personality. Part of it is the fierce hope that I do have that things can be better. But I don't want to see just, individual kids doing better, individual teachers doing better. I want the whole system to change. And so in that way, I guess, it's like when I broke my wrist. I broke my wrist this winter, and it's still not great. And I'm really impatient. When I'm sick, I'm really impatient. So I guess that I'm also impatient as a scholar. And Freire wrote about this. He talked about being impatiently patient. And I guess that's what that describes me. Or patiently impatient, either one. Because I am there for the long haul. That's why even though I retired, quote, as one of my daughters says in quotes, almost 9 years ago, I'm busier than ever.
Sure.
I keep writing, I keep speaking, and this work excites me, motivates me, it keeps me going, it really does. That's one of the titles of one of my books, What Keeps Teachers Going. This work keeps me going. Yeah.
In fact, Dr. Louise Moll describes your most significant accomplishment as your advocacy for and support of teachers and your dynamic and passionate views of teaching, especially in terms of developing a culturally relevant and intellectually potent pedagogy for students, as per the title of your best-selling book, Why We Teach. Why do we now, as per the title of this book and its recent sequel, what do you mean by now? Why do we teach now? Is the sequel to the book.
Right.
Why do we teach now?
Well, what I did was ask teacher educators around the country to nominate teachers who could articulate why they teach now, and who were sophisticated in their understanding of teaching. And so not just Pollyannas, because I hope that I'm not just a Pollyanna, so who are hopeful but also critical. And so I got some wonderful teachers to write essays. And they write about why they teach now as, a lot of reasons. And a lot of the things that I found with the first Why We Teach book, I found the second time around. But this time around, there was more cynicism, I guess. There was more fear. There was more doubt. And people are still there, these wonderful teachers. Some, 3 of the teachers have retired. These are not the same teachers except for 3 who I included in the second volume. One of them taught for 42 years, Mary Ginley. I'm still in touch with her all the time. We're very good friends. And she's a fabulous writer and was a phenomenal teacher. And she said when she sat down to write her essay, she thought, why on earth would anybody with any brains and imagination ever want to teach now? And then Mary's full of stories, and she goes through all these stories. And after each one, she says, so that's why I teach now. I teach now, or I did teach now, because there are kids out there who need us.
Sure.
And so I think, for a lot of the teachers, in spite of how difficult the situation has become, they're very dedicated. They're committed to the kids, to the ideal of public education as it should be, to helping kids become empowered, to helping kids recognize their strengths and their talents, their identities, and to feel good about them, to help kids feel smart. Another of the teachers, Mary Cowie, who wrote in both volumes, and she's still teaching. I remember once talking to her. She said that there were always a lot of people who wanted to get their kids into her first or second grade classroom, because she used to loop with the kids as she went from first to second. And there were a lot of parents. And that one parent once said to her, well, I want my kid in the smart kids class. Meanwhile, Mary had asked to be the classroom where all the English language learners were. So in any other school, it wouldn't have been called the smart kids class. She had 7 or 8 English language learners. Some came from very, economically poor backgrounds. But culturally rich. And so she said to this parent, my kids get smart. They get smart. It's not something that you are, it's what you can become. And I think that's an attitude that is a really wonderful attitude, because it shows that, that your biology is not destiny, and economics is not destiny. But everybody needs opportunities, and not everybody has opportunities.
Sure. Your daughter, Alicia Lopez, explains that Papi and Mommy, your grandparents, would be so proud to know that their Sonita had affected and inspired so many educators, and yet that you have influenced multicultural education in the way that you have. She adds that you have come a long way from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, but you have never forgotten your roots and continue to be proud of them, which also inspires many others. You put into the hands of teachers and teacher educators, as well as school administrators and faculty, realistic tools for how to approach the changes that are needed to move us into a public education system that truly serves the needs of our millions of students from all backgrounds. She adds that the sanity and sustenance of our nation is at the center, and that you're working hard to prepare us to do the work that needs to be done. What is the work that still needs to be done? Oh,
there's a lot of work to be done still. I think that we need to look really seriously at teacher education and how we prepare teachers. So I think that's part of the work that needs to be done. We need to prepare teachers to teach the kids who are currently in our classrooms and not the ones that were there 50 or 100 years ago, because sure, it's a completely different country now. And so that means that teachers need to learn about their students and not some generic students, because there's no such thing. Teachers also need to learn about who they are. They need to look very deeply at their own attitudes and values, at the biases that they might bring into a classroom, and to work on those. And that's hard work, but it's work that needs to be done. That's something that I tried to do with all my classes over the years. And it wasn't a touchy-feely thing. It was really hard work to try to figure out who you are and what you bring into this work. And so just saying that you love kids and that's why you want to be a teacher is not enough. Mm-hmm. What else is driving you? So there's a lot of work to be done. I think beyond what teachers can do, because I don't want to just focus on teachers, because then we might get the impression that teachers can do it all, and teachers cannot do it all.
Right.
It really is a systemic and structural problem. We need to look at how schools are funded, for example, because some schools are, so underfunded, and yet often the kids who need the most get the least.
Sure.
We need to look, as I said, at teacher preparation. We need to look at the whole accountability structure. We need to look at privatization and how that's changing schools. We need to look at racism and structural discrimination and how that is wreaking havoc, and has for many, many years, on children and their communities. So we need to. There's a lot of work to be done on the personal level, on the school level, on the institutional level. The larger structures, the national level. Of course, there's lots of work to be done, and everybody has a role to play in changing things.
Sure. And getting that through to policy as well.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Your research and scholarship has had a significant national and international impact, as noted, but it has also had an international impact in many countries, including Puerto Rico, and for folks from Puerto Rico, native and otherwise. Tell us about your experiences teaching and working in terms of your scholarship abroad.
Yeah, well, my husband is from Spain, and so I've been able to do some work there, not because he's from there, but because I've met scholars from there who have invited me. It's very interesting because multicultural education is not something that is that only happens in the United States, although for a while it seemed like that. And a number of years ago, a good number of years ago, after Affirming Diversity, so it was after 1992, it was probably 1994 or 5, a professor came over to me at AERA, and he was from Spain, and he said that he was interested in bringing me to Spain, to Santiago de Compostela in the north of Spain, as a visiting professor. And I frankly was surprised, because several years before, when I was writing Affirming Diversity and we were living in Spain, so it was 1989, 1990, and people would say to me, "So what are you working on?" And I would say, I'm working on a book on multicultural education. And they would have one of two reactions. One would be, "What's that?" because they hadn't heard of it. And the other was, "Oh, we don't have those problems here." Oh. Which made me laugh all the time, because, of course, they do.
Sure.
And so when Miguel, this professor Miguel Santos, met me at ARA several years later, like 1995 probably, he said, "We know your work in Spain, and so we'd like to invite you." And well, I was so surprised, because a few years before they had never heard of this, and
sure.
Now multicultural education is something that people take very seriously. Most of them call it intercultural education. So the focus is a little bit different. But I was as a visiting professor there. I was I spoke at a conference in Almeria, also in Spain. And in Puerto Rico, I was a visiting professor for a couple of weeks a few years ago. And so that's been very rewarding. And then in South Africa, I was a visiting professor for 5 weeks, actually, at Wits University. And all of these, you know, I have felt that I have gotten more out of these experiences than I've been able to give, because they've been so enriching for me. But hopefully people have gotten something out of my visits as well.